The opening and the world of 1887. In the waning days of 1887, when the world still felt like it was balanced on the edge between the untamed wild and the creeping order of civilization, Sarah Mitchell found herself standing at a crossroads most people never faced. Not the kind of crossroads marked on a map, but the kind where the wrong turn could destroy what little remained of a person's life. She'd been told by more than one person, by nearly everyone in the small Colorado town of Millfield, that to take the job she was considering would be nothing short of inviting disaster. That man will ruin you, they'd said. He's worse than the winters here, meaner than a cornered coyote. The man in question was Marcus Thorne, a name that seemed to curdle the air whenever it was spoken. He wasn't just the richest rancher in 3 counties, he was the most feared. The ad had been printed in the Millfield Gazette in blocky black letters, housekeeper wanted. Good wages, room and board included. On the surface, it was simple enough, the kind of posting dozens of desperate women might chase in the wake of a long, hungry winter. But Sarah had quickly learned that the mention of Marcus Thorne turned good sense into caution and hope into suspicion. Even the printer at the Gazette, a man who claimed never to believe gossip, had muttered something about hard eyes and harder rules as he handed over her mail. Still, winter was coming. Not just the weather, but the long season of hunger frostbite and the slow erosion of dignity that awaited those who had neither money nor family to shelter them. Sarah had none of either. Her savings were gone spent on rent for a narrow room above the general store and bread that seemed to shrink in size each week. The town had offered her no kindness, only laundry jobs for pennies, and the unspoken alternative every woman understood, but few named aloud. She had sworn to her dying mother she would never go down that road, which meant her options had narrowed to almost nothing. So when she stood in the cold morning air with the paper in her hand, staring at those words, housekeeper wanted, she didn't see danger the way the others did. She saw the faint outline of a door still ajar. Maybe not a welcoming door, maybe not even a safe one, but one she could still walk through before it closed forever. And in that moment, she realized something she would remember for the rest of her life. Sometimes the jobs everyone warns you about are the ones that might just save you. The warning from Mrs. Henderson. The October wind in Millfield carried a kind of bitterness that had nothing to do with the weather. It came from the mountains, sharp and unrelenting, snatching at the hem of Sarah's worn coat, as if trying to pull her back from the edge of a decision she wasn't sure she could undo. She stood on the boardwalk outside the post office, reading the same advertisement for the 3rd time. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, though the air bit at her skin, but from the fraying thread of hope that kept her upright. The bell above the post office door jingled, and Mrs. Henderson emerged like an omen dressed in gray. Her hair was wound so tightly it looked as if a single loose pin might set the whole thing unraveling, and her eyes held the gleam of someone who fed herself on the misfortunes of others. "You're not seriously thinking of applying for that position, are you, dear?" she asked, her voice syrupy and sharp all at once. Sarah, who had been raised to meet challenges head-on, straightened her shoulders. "I might be." Mrs. Henderson clucked her tongue, the sound carrying the weight of prophecy. "Nobody lasts more than a month at Thorne Ranch. That man has a temper like a wildfire and a heart colder than January. 3 housekeepers in the past year alone, each one came back looking like they'd seen the devil himself." Sarah tried to keep her voice steady. And what exactly did they say about him? Lowering her tone to a whisper, Mrs. Henderson leaned in. They say he built that ranch with blood money, lost his family in a fire years back, and it turned him mean. Keeps to himself in that big house, drinking himself to death and barking orders at anyone fool enough to get close. Her eyes flickered with satisfaction, as though the words themselves were a warning and a triumph. Sarah felt the familiar twist of unease in her stomach, but she kept her gaze level. They also say he pays well. Money's not worth your life, child, or your sanity, Mrs. Henderson replied, smoothing her skirts. Mark my words, you take that job, you'll be back in town within a week, if you make it out at all. With that, she bustled away, leaving Sarah in the wind, with her doubts, her stubborn pride, and a scrap of newsprint that suddenly felt heavier than it had before. But even as the warning echoed in her mind, Sarah couldn't help but think that Mrs. Henderson's brand of fear was the kind people carried when they'd given up on trying. And Sarah, despite everything, wasn't ready to do that. The first glimpse of Marcus Thorne. The sound of hoofbeats carried over the dusty street, steady and deliberate, as if each strike of iron on packed earth announced something inevitable. Sarah looked up from the folded newspaper in time to see him, Marcus Thorne, ride into view. Even from a distance there was no mistaking him. He sat his horse with the kind of ease that came from years in the saddle, his black coat flaring behind him like the shadow of a storm. His hat was pulled low, shading his eyes, but his presence was enough to make smaller men step aside without a word. Women on the boardwalk found sudden interest in their shoes. Sarah's breath caught before she could stop it. He reined in outside. The saloon swung down with fluid grace and tied off his horse. There was nothing hurried about him. Every motion was precise, measured like a man who knew his own strength and saw no reason to prove it. Up close, she could see he was tall, broad-shouldered, with lines carved deep into his face, not by cruelty, but by weather and time. And then he turned as if sensing her stare. Their eyes met across the width of the street. His were the pale, unyielding blue of a winter sky, cold, distant, but holding something she couldn't quite name. Not kindness, not warmth, but perhaps recognition, though she was certain they had never met. The moment stretched taut between them until he looked away, pushing through the saloon doors and vanishing into the dim interior. Sarah stood frozen, the clatter of her heart louder than the wind. She didn't know why, but she was certain of one thing: whatever lay ahead at Thorne Ranch, it had just become more complicated. The journey to Thorne Ranch. The morning Sarah set out for Thorne Ranch dawned cold and sharp, the kind of cold that painted frost on the window panes like warnings in white. She'd woken before first light, her stomach knotted with a peculiar mixture of dread and determination that came when you knew you were about to do something you couldn't undo. Dressing in her best, though still modest, blue cotton dress, she pinned her hair back in a severe braid meant to look older, more capable, more employable. It was the only armor she could afford. At the livery, Mr. Peterson had loaned her an old but steady gelding, his eyes clouded with age but still alert. She promised to return the animal by evening, whether she had the job or not. The saddle creaked beneath her as she mounted, and the gelding's hooves struck the frozen earth with a dull rhythm, each step carrying her further from Millfield and deeper into the unknown. The trail twisted through stands of aspen and pine, the last of autumn's golden leaves whispering in the wind like they knew secrets she didn't. The air grew wilder with each mile, the mountains rising higher on the horizon until they seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. By the time the trees opened into rolling meadows, Sarah's fingers were numb on the reins, but her eyes were wide with the sight before her. Thorne Ranch rose from the valley floor like it had been planted there by the land itself. The main house was massive, built from honey-colored stone and dark timber, with porches wrapping three sides like outstretched arms. Barns, corrals, bunkhouses, all were kept in such careful order it was impossible to imagine the chaos people claimed lurked within. This wasn't the lair of a madman. It was the stronghold of someone who understood the value of building something to last. She slowed the gelding at the main gate, her courage flickering as she read the sign hanging from wrought iron hinges. Thorne Ranch established 1878. Below that, smaller words burned into the wood caught her eye. Welcome to those who come in peace. Before she could lose her nerve, she nudged the horse forward. The drive to the house felt longer than it looked, each hoofbeat loud on the hard-packed earth. When she reached the barn, a man emerged, weathered face, kind eyes, the easy gait of someone who knew both the land and the people who worked it. "Morning, miss," he greeted, touching the brim of his hat. "You looking for someone? I'm here about the housekeeper position," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady. His gaze shifted, a flicker of sympathy passing through it. "Mr. Thorne's up at the house. Name's Tom Brady. Been foreman here going on 8 years now." He hesitated. "You sure about this?" "He's not a bad man, but he's not an easy one either." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I'm sure." Tom nodded slowly. "All right then. I'll take you up. Fair warning, he's been in a darker mood than usual. Lost another housekeeper last week, and it's got him thinking he ought to just live alone for good." With that, they walked up the stone steps toward the front porch. Every step felt like walking deeper into the pages of a story she wasn't sure she wanted to read, but one she knew she couldn't put down. The interview. The door opened to reveal Marcus Thorne in full. If he'd seemed imposing from across the street in Millfield up close, he was formidable, well over 6 feet shoulders, built from years of wrangling cattle, dark hair threaded with early silver. His eyes, that pale winter blue, studied her in a silence so heavy she felt it in her bones. "You're here about the job," he said, voice deep and rough, the kind of voice meant to carry over open country. "Yes, sir." Sarah Mitchell. She extended her hand before she could think better of it. He looked at it as though it were an unfamiliar object before taking it briefly. His grip was firm, calloused but not punishing. "Come inside," he said, stepping back. The front hall soared 2 stories, light filtering down over a staircase that curved like it had been built for a grander life than the one it now held. But it was the silence that struck her, not the peaceful quiet of a well-kept home, but the hollow kind left behind when laughter dies and doesn't return. Marcus led her into a sitting room, fine furniture, arranged with precision, a massive stone fireplace swept clean and cold. On the mantel, a single photograph lay face down. He remained standing while she sat on the edge of a velvet chair. The last 3 housekeepers lasted 2 weeks, 1 month, and 4 days respectively, he said without preamble. They all claimed I was impossible to work for. "What makes you think you'll be different? Maybe I won't be," Sarah admitted. "But I need this job, and I'm willing to work harder than anyone you've had before." He studied her. "What kind of need drives a woman to work for a man everyone calls a monster? The kind that comes from having 53 cents to your name and nowhere else to go." Something flickered in his eyes, gone as quickly as it came. He laid out the rules, strict schedules, spotless upkeep, absolute respect for his privacy. No second chances, no reforming him. Sarah met each demand with steady agreement. Finally, he named the pay $30 a month plus room and board. It was more than she dared hope for. "You can move in today if you're ready," he said. "I'm ready. Then Tom will show you to your quarters. Try not to make me regret this decision." The first day's life at Thorne Ranch settled into a rhythm that was at once demanding and strangely comforting. Sarah rose before dawn, the mountain air biting at her skin as she lit the kitchen stove. By the time Marcus appeared, always precisely at 6, his coffee was poured black and unsweetened his eggs over easy bacon crisp, but not burnt. He ate in silence, eyes fixed on the newspaper, and disappeared into the day's work without a word. The silence in the house was so complete it felt like a physical thing pressing in around her. For many, it might have been suffocating. But Sarah had grown up in quiet rooms, moving softly so as not to wake her ill mother, learning to work without asking for attention. Where others saw isolation, Sarah saw a kind of peace. The house was large and orderly, each room meticulously maintained, though it felt more like a preserved museum than a living home. On the 4th morning, dusting the sitting room, her cloth caught the edge of the photograph on the mantel. It flipped face up. A younger Marcus stood behind a woman with laughing eyes and a little girl missing her front teeth. The woman's hand rested on her rounded belly. Sarah stared until the weight of understanding settled over her. This was not the home of a cruel man. It was the shrine of a broken one. The face-up photograph. And what it meant. Sarah didn't move for a long time after the photograph fell forward, as though her stillness could keep time from flowing again. The image captured something so vivid, so startlingly alive, that it felt almost wrong for it to be here in this silent, cold room. Marcus was younger in the picture, his features softened, not by age, but by the presence of joy. One hand rested protectively on the shoulder of a woman whose beauty came not from perfection, but from the way her eyes seemed to laugh even in stillness. Beside them stood a little girl, front teeth missing grin wide enough to bridge the world between innocence and mischief. And there, beneath the delicate lace of the woman's sleeve, her other hand cradled a rounded belly. Expecting another child, expecting a future. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She knew without asking that these were the ghosts that walked the halls of Thorne Ranch. It explained the cold hearth, the face-down photograph, the immaculate rooms that looked as if no one had lived in them for years. This was not a house built for efficiency alone. It was a house meant to cradle a family. She reached out almost without thinking to turn the photograph back over. Her fingers lingered for a moment on the smooth wood of the frame. Reverence came naturally when you were touching someone else's most sacred thing. Then she set it face down again as it had been, returning the barrier Marcus had built. All afternoon the image haunted her, the laughing woman, the wide-eyed child. The man who had stood behind them, hand-steady eyes, alight with something she had not yet seen in him. It was as if she'd been allowed one fleeting glimpse behind the fortress walls. By the time Marcus returned from the day's work, Sarah was in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, the scent of supper filling the air. He came in silent as always, but when their eyes met, she wondered if he could see the change in her, if he could sense that she knew a piece of his truth now. If he did, he gave no sign. But Sarah, for the first time since arriving, found herself looking at him, not as the man the town feared, but as the man in that photograph. Someone who had once believed in love so completely it had been captured forever in silver and glass. The forbidden study. It happened on a day when the wind was keening through the eaves, rattling the windows like some restless spirit looking for a way in. Marcus had ridden out early, and the house was hers alone. She'd been moving through her weekly cleaning circuit floors, scrubbed rugs, beaten laundry dried by the kitchen fire, when her steps slowed in front of the one door she'd been told was off limits. The study. The wood was dark, the brass knob dulled by years of use. She shouldn't open it. She knew she shouldn't. But the thought of this room, so obviously important to him, gathering dust while the rest of the house shone, felt wrong. Her hand closed around the knob before she could talk herself out of it. The hinges creaked in protest as she eased the door open. The room smelled of leather paper and something that reminded her of her father's workshop, honest work, and long hours of thought. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, the books worn from use, not neglect. A massive oak desk commanded the center, its surface crowded with ledgers, correspondence, and documents she did not read. Sarah moved through the space with quiet efficiency, dusting, sweeping, and setting small things right without altering their place. She found a coffee cup on a side table, the dregs growing a pale skin. She washed it in the kitchen and returned it exactly where she'd found it. The sound of hoofbeats on the drive jolted her back to herself. She slipped out through the small back door into the kitchen garden, returning to her work there just as Marcus's boots sounded in the front hall. That evening over supper, his voice came unexpectedly. The study smells like lemon oil. Sarah's pulse spiked. "Yes, sir," she admitted. "I told you it was off limits." "You did, sir." She met his gaze steady. Why? Because a room full of books shouldn't smell like neglect. She thought and said aloud, "Because even forbidden spaces deserve respect." He studied her for a long moment, then returned to his meal. "Don't touch the desk. I wouldn't dream of it." And that was the end of it. No anger, no dismissal, just an unspoken shift between them. The illness. The first snow came heavy and wet, the kind that clung to the trees and muffled the world. Sarah rose early to light the kitchen fires, but when 6 o'clock came and Marcus did not appear for breakfast, unease prickled at her. He was never late. By past, she was outside his door knocking softly. No answer. A louder knock. Still nothing, only a low sound somewhere between a groan and a cough. She turned the knob and stepped inside. Marcus was in bed, half upright, skin flushed with fever, dark hair plastered to his forehead. He tried to sit up when he saw her. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "When did this start last night?" "Just a cold." The words dissolved into a violent cough. Sarah crossed to him, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. "This isn't a cold, Mr. Thorne. This is influenza. I'll be fine. You'll be dead if someone doesn't take care of you," she said bluntly. "Now stop being stubborn and let me help." For a moment, his eyes locked on hers in silent defiance. But fever had a way of stripping men down to their most human selves. His shoulders eased. He sank back into the pillows. Sarah moved into the chair beside his bed, damp cloth in hand, coaxing him to drink broth and water when he was awake enough to swallow. Through the long, fevered nights, she heard him murmur names, Emma, Lily, pleading with them not to go. In those moments, her heart ached, not for the feared rancher, but for the man who had once had a family to lose. On the third morning, the fever broke. His eyes opened to find her still there, hair loose from exhaustion, hands still steady. "You stayed," he whispered. "Where else would I go?" And for the first time, Marcus Thorne almost smiled. Discovering Lily's room. The house was steeped in its usual quiet that morning, the kind of stillness Sarah had grown used to, a stillness so complete you could hear the sigh of the wind in the chimneys and the distant creak of the old timbers settling against the cold. She was rolling out biscuit dough in the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of her work a kind of comfort, when a sound drifted through the air that didn't belong. It was faint at first, swallowed by the thick walls, but it reached her ears with the unmistakable timbre of sorrow. Not wind, not the cry of a trapped animal. This was human weeping. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, frowning, listening. The sound came again, quieter now, but sharper, like the cut of a blade drawn across something tender. Without thinking, she moved through the hallway, her boots soft against the polished wood, following the sound deeper into the house. Past the sitting room, past a narrow corridor she had never had reason to enter before. The air back here felt different, cooler, as though the sun rarely touched these rooms. When she reached the doorway, she hesitated, hand hovering over the frame. The weeping was close, now raw and unguarded. She stepped inside. It was a child's room, smaller than the others she'd cleaned, but painted in a warm, soft yellow that seemed to hold onto the light even in winter. White trim lined the walls, and shelves filled with books and toys stood like patient sentinels waiting for a child who would never return. And there, on the floor beside a narrow bed, sat Marcus Thorne. His broad shoulders were bowed, his large hands clutching a rag doll with yarn hair and a faded dress. His eyes were red-rimmed, his cheeks wet, and his breath came in shuddering pulls between sobs. Sarah's first instinct was to retreat, to spare him the embarrassment of being seen like this, but the sound of his grief pinned her to the spot. It was not the distant mourning of someone recalling an old wound. It was the keening of fresh loss, immediate and sharp. He looked up when he sensed her presence. His voice, when it came, was cracked and low. Today would have been her 10th birthday. Sarah stepped closer, careful as though approaching a wounded animal. "Lily," he nodded the word, catching in his throat. "Emma, her mother made such a fuss about birthdays. Cake for breakfast, presents all-day songs until we were hoarse. I tried to forget this date, but..." His voice broke and he gripped the doll tighter. "Some dates burn themselves into your bones." Sarah lowered herself to the floor beside him, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel her there. "Tell me about her," she said softly. For a long time, Marcus stared at the doll as though it held the essence of the little girl. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier, but tinged with awe, stubborn as a mule. Cleverer than most grown men. She could ride before she could properly walk. She named this doll Rosie because she thought it looked like it was always blushing. He huffed a broken laugh. She was going to be someone who would change the world. The room seemed to tighten around them, the air thick with love and loss. Sarah glanced around at the carefully kept shelves, the untouched bedspread, the small rocking chair in the corner. It was clear no one had touched a thing since Lily's last day here. This room wasn't just memory, it was preservation. And in that moment, Sarah understood something that went deeper than any gossip in Millfield ever. Could Marcus Thorne wasn't a man hardened by cruelty. He was a man living in the ruins of his own happiness, holding fast to the pieces he could still grasp. The confession in the yellow room. Marcus's words seemed to hang in the air, heavy enough to bend it, fragile enough that Sarah didn't dare break the silence too quickly. She could feel the grief radiating from him, like heat from a dying fire, steady consuming, but contained only by sheer force of will. Her hands rested loosely on her lap, her knees drawn in slightly, her body angled toward him without intrusion. "I shouldn't be in here," Marcus said after a long moment, his voice quiet but threaded with guilt. "I've kept it exactly the same. Her clothes, her books, her bed, all waiting as if she might walk through that door again. Tom thinks I've lost my mind." Sarah's gaze traveled over the room, taking in the evidence of a life paused mid-breath. A stack of storybooks with a ribbon marking the last page rid a half-filled sketch pad on the desk, a pair of scuffed boots lined neatly by the dresser. "Grief doesn't follow anyone else's timeline," she said gently. "And love doesn't disappear just because someone does." He glanced at her eyes shadowed as if weighing whether her words were comfort or intrusion. Then his gaze dropped to the doll in his hands. "She used to climb into our bed every morning before dawn. Cold little feet pressed against my back, whispering about her dreams so her mama wouldn't wake up. Emma would pretend to be asleep, but I could see her smiling." He swallowed hard, a small tremor running through him. "We were so happy, Sarah. Foolishly, completely happy." The use of her first name startled her. In all their weeks under the same roof, he'd never spoken it like that, unarmored, uncalculated. "What was Emma like?" Sarah asked softly. A ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth. "Wise. Fierce. She had a way of making you believe you could do anything. She loved this land as much as I did, maybe more. Said it was the kind of place that could raise a child to be strong and good." Sarah's eyes drifted to the window where pale winter light spilled across the yellow walls. "She sounds like someone who knew how to make a home." "She did," Marcus said simply. And for a heartbeat his voice was warm. Then it cooled again. "The fire started in the barn. I'd ridden out to check the north pasture. By the time I got back, half the house was gone. The wind was strong, carried the flames straight up the siding. I could hear them screaming from upstairs, but the stairs were already gone." His voice had dropped into something hollow. "I broke windows trying to find a way in. Tom and two of the hands had to hold me back. I would have run straight into it, but they wouldn't let me. The heat was so fierce it melted the snow 20 feet away." Sarah's throat burned with the weight of his words. "You did everything you could." He turned toward her, then eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her hold her breath. Would they know that? Would they believe it? Or are they somewhere wondering why I wasn't strong enough, fast enough, smart enough to save them? Without thinking, Sarah reached out, laying her hand over his. It was warm, solid, calloused, the same hand that had greeted her with such formality the day they met, now trembling under her touch. "They're not wondering that. They're grateful you survived. Grateful you remember them. Grateful you still love them." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint rattle of the window in its frame. The slow, steady breathing of two people who had both learned that survival sometimes feels like the cruelest task of all. The comfort Sarah offers. Something shifted, They're not a grand cinematic change, but a subtle loosening, as though one knot in the thick rope of his grief had finally eased. Marcus let out a breath that sounded like it had been caught in his chest for 5 years. He set the doll back on the bed, smoothing its faded dress with a tenderness that made Sarah's own chest ache. "I used to come in here every night," he said almost to himself. Sit in that chair and tell her about my day like she was still listening. But after you came, he stopped, as if the admission was dangerous. I stopped. Felt like I was betraying them somehow, like being happy again meant I'd let go. Sarah shook her head. Being happy isn't betrayal. It's what they'd want for you. Is it? His gaze roamed the room as if searching for Emma's voice in the shadows. How do you know when it's time to stop grieving, to close the door, to try again? I don't think you ever really stop, Sarah said carefully. But you learn to carry it differently. You find that sorrow can live alongside joy, that it doesn't erase the love, it just changes its shape. Marcus was quiet for a long while, and she wondered if she'd overstepped. Then slowly he stood still, holding the doll for one last moment before placing it gently on the bed. Emma used to say life was like a river, always moving, always changing, but still the same water. You can dam it up for a while, but eventually it will find a way to flow again. She sounds like a wise woman, Sarah said, rising to stand beside him. She was. He hesitated, then added, she would have liked you. Said the best people are the ones who show up when everyone else runs. The words warmed Sarah in a way no fire could. They carried the weight of trust, of something unspoken but real. What would you like to do today? She asked. He glanced around the room once more, as though sealing it in memory. I think I'd like breakfast. Maybe you could tell me about your family while we eat. It was a small thing, but Sarah recognized it for what it was, an invitation into the guarded spaces of his life. They left the room together, and Sarah swore she felt the house itself breathe a little easier, as if it had been holding its breath all these years. Back in the kitchen, the biscuits were cold, but she warmed them while he brewed fresh coffee. Snow fell steadily outside, but inside there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the tentative beginnings of something new. They ate in silence for a while until Marcus asked about her parents. She told him about her father's gentle hands, her mother's fierce love, the small farm they'd lost, about how she'd come west chasing a new beginning only to find herself in a town that offered none. I used to think I was cursed, she admitted, that maybe I wasn't meant for happiness, but coming here, I think maybe I was wrong. Marcus didn't answer immediately, but when he did, there was the faintest curve to his mouth. Sometimes the thing that scares you most is exactly the thing you need. And for the first time, Sarah felt like maybe, just maybe, they were both learning how to live again. A morning in snow and sharing. Her story. December came not as a whisper, but as a siege. Snow had been falling for 2 days straight, piling in soft drifts against the stone walls of Thorne Ranch, muting the world, until it felt like they lived inside a snow globe that had been shaken and forgotten. The wind sang low and lonely through the eaves, and Sarah had grown accustomed to the new rhythm. Winter demanded longer nights, slower mornings, and the constant tending of fires to keep the cold at bay. That morning she rose before first light, as always, stoking the embers in the kitchen stove until they glowed red and ready to catch. The scent of rising bread mingled with the faint tang of wood smoke. It was while she was brushing flour from her hands that she noticed the change not in the house itself, but in the silence between its walls. It no longer pressed in around her like an unwelcome guest. It felt softer somehow. She was halfway through rolling biscuit dough when Marcus entered. He paused at the kitchen doorway as if the warmth inside startled him after the cold hallway. Snow clung to his coat and hair, the sharp bite of outside air trailing in behind him. He shrugged off his coat and hung it by the door without a word, but Sarah caught the faintest upward curve at the corner of his mouth. They ate breakfast at the long wooden table, steam rising from mugs of coffee. The world outside blurred white through the frosted windows. At first they spoke of small things, the stubborn gate in the south pasture, the milk cow due to calve in spring. But then Marcus surprised her. "Tell me about your family," he said, his voice quiet but steady, like he was testing a bridge he wasn't sure could hold. Sarah set down her coffee. "My father was a gentle man," she began. "He had this way of fixing things without making a fuss. Fences, wagons, my mistakes. My mother, she was fierce. She could work a field from dawn to dusk, then come inside and cook for half the town if they showed up. She believed in loving hard and working harder." Marcus listened without interrupting, his gaze steady but not invasive. Sarah found herself telling him more than she'd meant to about the illness that had worn her mother down to a shadow, about her father's sudden passing 6 months ago, about the small farm they'd been forced to sell. "I thought coming west would be a fresh start," she admitted. "Instead, I ended up in Millfield taking in laundry and watching my savings vanish 1 penny at a time. By the time I saw your ad, I had 53 cents and a prayer." Marcus didn't smile exactly, but his eyes softened. "And you still came. I've learned that sometimes the jobs everyone warns you about are the ones worth taking," she said, a faint smile on her lips. They finished breakfast in a companionable silence, the kind that had weight but not burden. When Marcus stood to go tend the livestock, he paused at the door. "Thank you," he said, as if the two simple words carried far more than gratitude for a meal. And Sarah, standing in the warm kitchen with the snow still falling beyond the windows, realized that maybe they were both beginning to believe in second chances, beginning to build a new home. By the middle of December, Thorne Ranch no longer felt like the fortress it had been when Sarah arrived. The walls still held their share of ghosts, but the air inside carried a subtle warmth, now the kind that came not from the fire, but from the presence of life. Sarah noticed the changes in small ways. First, a mug left on the kitchen table, instead of taken away in silence. The faint sound of footsteps in the hall during hours when Marcus would usually be shut away in his study, a question about her day asked without the usual guarded edge. One evening she found him standing by the front window as the light faded from the sky, watching snow drift in the deepening dusk. He didn't move when she entered, just said, "The hands will need hot coffee in the morning before they start clearing the drive." It was practical, mundane, but the fact that he'd thought aloud, included her in the planning of his day, felt like a quiet milestone. The ranch hands began to notice too. Tom Brady caught her in the barn one afternoon carrying feed buckets and gave her a knowing smile. "You've got him talking again," he said. "Not much, but more than I've heard in years." Sarah had laughed it off, but the truth was she'd seen the difference herself in the way Marcus's voice carried across the yard, now not just issuing orders, but greeting the men asking after their families. In the evenings when the work was done and the fires burned steady, Sarah sometimes hummed while she cleaned the kitchen or mended linens. The first night she caught herself doing it, she stopped abruptly, surprised by the sound. She couldn't remember the last time she had hummed without thinking, without forcing cheer into the air. Marcus, passing through on his way upstairs, paused and listened for a moment before continuing without a word. But the next night she hummed again, and this time didn't stop. One particularly cold morning, Sarah stood on the porch watching the sky turn from indigo to gold, the snow underfoot crunching softly. Marcus joined her without announcement, his breath curling in the frosty air. They didn't speak for a long time, just watched the sun climb over the ridge, setting the snowfields ablaze with light. "This place is different now," he said finally, almost to himself. "How so?" "Feels more like—" He trailed off, searching for the word. "A home." Sarah looked at him, then the pale light catching in his eyes. "That's what it's supposed to feel like." He nodded, and for a moment she thought she saw the shadow of the man in the photograph, the one who had once stood with his family, believing the world was theirs to hold. Inside, the fire snapped in the hearth, coffee warmed on the stove, and the ranch waited for the day to begin. And for the first time since her arrival, Sarah didn't feel like a guest or an employee or even an outsider. She felt like part of the place, as if Thorne Ranch, in its own quiet way, had claimed her. A new rhythm of trust. By late December, life at Thorne Ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt nothing like the guarded, chilly routine Sarah had stepped into weeks before. The days still began early, before the first blush of light touched the mountains, and the work remained steady and unrelenting. But there was a subtle difference now, an almost imperceptible warmth that had begun to color even the coldest mornings. Marcus had always been punctual, appearing at 6 on the dot for breakfast, eating in silence and vanishing to his day's work. But lately he lingered. Not long, not enough to make it obvious to anyone but her, but enough for Sarah to notice. A second cup of coffee before heading out. A question about the weather or the state of the pantry. One morning, when she mentioned the bread rising faster than expected because of the extra heat from the stove, he had glanced toward the kitchen, lips twitching as if holding back a smile. Trust was growing between them, but it was the kind that built itself slowly, like snow layering on a roof, until one day you realized the whole thing was covered. Sarah found herself less careful about measuring her words, more willing to share her thoughts. Marcus, in turn, seemed less inclined to keep every answer clipped and impersonal. One afternoon, when a sudden storm rolled in over the ridge, she was in the barn loft checking hay bales when Marcus appeared below. "Tom says you've been hauling water for the chickens yourself," he called up, voice carrying easily over the rustle of straw. "I have," she replied, leaning over the railing to look at him. "There's no need. I'll have one of the hands see to it." "I don't mind," she said. "Besides, they're less likely to spill it." That earned her a look, half exasperation, half something else. "Stubborn," he said finally, shaking his head before leaving the barn. Later, she found a new bucket and a heavier-duty scoop by the chicken coop. He never mentioned it, but she noticed. The evenings had shifted, too. The silence between them at supper was no longer the oppressive kind. It was comfortable, companionable. Sometimes he would tell her about a particularly difficult calf-to-rope or a fence line washed out by melting snow. She would share small things about her day. The jar of preserved peaches she'd found in the pantry, the way the snow had drifted in patterns like lace, along the fence rails. One night, as she cleared the table, she caught Marcus watching her from his seat by the fire. Not in the wary way he had when she first arrived, but with a kind of quiet thoughtfulness, as if trying to memorize something without her noticing. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. The trust wasn't just in words or gestures, it was in the way they began to move around each other, passing in the hall without the stiffness of strangers, working side by side in the kitchen during the occasional busy morning without stepping on each other's rhythm. There was an ease forming here, one that made Sarah feel the house itself was beginning to relax, as though it had been braced against the cold for years and was finally thawing. And though neither of them said it, both understood trust was the foundation for anything that might come next. Winter's test and shared resolve. The winter deepened in January. The snow on the high ridges packed so tightly it gleamed under the sun like polished stone. With the cold came new challenges, frozen troughs, drifting snow that swallowed fence posts, and nights when the wind howled so fiercely the shutters rattled against their hinges. It was during one of those bitter nights that the ranch faced its first real test since Sarah had arrived. The storm had been building all afternoon, the sky pressing low and dark. Marcus had been out in the north pasture, checking on a herd that had moved too far toward the tree line. Sarah watched for the kitchen window as the snow thickened, the wind driving it sideways in icy sheets. By the time dusk fell, visibility was so poor she could barely make out the barn from the porch. She kept supper warm, pacing the kitchen, glancing toward the door each time the wind slammed against it. It wasn't until well past the usual hour that she heard boots crunching over packed snow. Marcus stepped inside, coated in frost, his coat stiff with ice. "You're late," she said before she could stop herself. His expression softened at her tone. Had to move the herd back toward the lower pasture. One of the calves was down, took longer than I planned. "Is it all right?" "It will be. Tom's staying in the barn tonight to make sure of it." She ushered him toward the table, setting a steaming bowl in front of him. He ate without protest, thawing in the glow of the kitchen fire. When he finished, he leaned back, eyes half closed in exhaustion. "You worry," he said quietly. "I care," she corrected. That earned her a long look, one that seemed to see more than she was saying. "I've had people here before," he said slowly, "but none who stayed when it got hard." "I'm not here for easy," Sarah replied. "I'm here because I chose to be." The wind rattled the windows then, but the sound felt distant compared to the weight of the moment between them. Marcus reached for his coffee, then paused, fingers resting lightly on the cup. "Then I suppose I should make sure you have reason to keep choosing." It wasn't a promise in so many words, but Sarah understood it as one. That night, as the storm roared outside, she sat by the fire, mending a shirt, Marcus in the opposite chair, boots stretched toward the hearth. No words passed between them, but the shared quiet was solid, unshakable, the kind of quiet built on the knowledge that they were in this together, now whatever came. The boundaries shift. By mid-January, the rhythm they'd found together had become so natural that Sarah sometimes forgot it hadn't always been this way. The winter was still fierce, the work still constant, but the undercurrent of tension that had once run through the house was gone. Now when Marcus came in from the cold, he paused at the kitchen doorway to unlace his gloves, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on her. She noticed it every time, how he seemed to relax, only after that glance. The shift in boundaries was subtle at first. A question about whether she needed anything from town, a habit of leaving his study door ajar when he worked the fire inside, flickering an invitation. One afternoon, while she was mending linens at the big oak table, he walked in carrying an old leather coat with a torn sleeve. He laid it down in front of her without a word, but the look in his eyes was both a request and a trust. She repaired it carefully, and when she returned it to him that evening, he wore it the next day without mentioning the repair at all. It was on a late afternoon, the light already fading to indigo, that the change between them took a more visible form. Sarah was in the pantry balancing a sack of flour on her hip when she heard voices out front. Not Marcus's low timbre or Tom's steady baritone, these were rougher, unfamiliar. When she stepped to the window, she saw two men on horseback at the gate, their posture too casual to be friendly. Marcus had already stepped out onto the porch. She watched him speak to the men, his voice calm, but edged with steel. One of them laughed in a way that made her skin prickle, gesturing toward the house. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She knew the look of men trying to press past a boundary that wasn't theirs to cross. Marcus's reply was short, his body, squared shoulders, broad against the wind. Whatever he said made the men's expressions darken before they turned their horses and rode off toward the tree line. When he came back inside, his coat was dusted with snow, his jaw tight. He shut the door and looked at her. "You don't open the door to anyone unless you know their voice," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I wouldn't," she assured him. "They've been sniffing around for a while, trying to buy grazing rights near the south pasture. They don't take no easily." Sarah nodded, the flour sack still balanced in her arms. "Good thing you're not in the habit of changing your answer." That drew a flicker of something in his eyes, almost a smile. "Exactly." He took the sack from her without asking and carried it to the pantry, setting it down as if it weighed nothing. The gesture wasn't just helpful, it was protective, an unspoken acknowledgement that her safety was now part of his domain. That night, as the wind rose outside, Sarah found herself replaying the scene at the gate. Not just the way Marcus had stood between the men and the house, but the way he'd looked at her, afterward assessing steady, as if silently promising that nothing would touch her while she was under his roof. And she realized then that the boundaries between them weren't just shifting. They were being rebuilt into something stronger, something that belonged to both of them. An evening by the fire. It was another week before the next storm blew in, this one carrying a brittle, biting cold that settled into the bones of the house. The snow came fast and hard, driven in sheets against the windows, and the temperature dropped so sharply that the water in the pail by the back door froze overnight. That evening, Marcus brought in an extra armload of wood for the hearth, stacking it neatly beside the fire before lowering himself into the chair opposite hers. Sarah sat curled on the settee, a basket of mending in her lap, the firelight warming her cheeks. The silence between them was the kind that had weight and presence, each moment marked by the soft crackle of burning logs. "Storm's going to last a while," Marcus said at length. "Best we settle in." She glanced toward the window where the snow blurred everything beyond into shapeless white. "I've enough flour and beans to keep us for a week, and the cellars still got potatoes." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her longer than usual. "You think ahead." "Most people don't." Sarah smiled faintly. "Most people haven't had to make 53 cents last as long as I have." He huffed a low sound that might have been a laugh, and for a moment the air between them softened even more. She returned to her sewing, but she could feel his eyes on her now and then, as if he were trying to memorize the sight of her in this room, the calm industry, the quiet presence, the way the firelight caught in her hair. When she pricked her finger on the needle and hissed softly, Marcus was up before she could even set the basket down. "Let me see," he said, crossing to her. "It's nothing, let me see." His voice wasn't sharp, but it brooked no argument. She extended her hand, and he took it gently in his own. His touch was warm despite the cold air between the windows, and for a moment neither moved. He examined the tiny bead of blood, then released her hand with a quiet, "Be careful." The words were simple, but they landed differently, less about the sewing needle and more about something larger, something unspoken. Later, when the lamps were turned down and the fire was burning low, they sat in companionable silence. Marcus leaned back in his chair, boots stretched toward the warm thighs, half closed. Sarah found herself watching him tracing the lines that grief had carved into his face. The silver at his temples, the quiet strength in his hands. And for the first time since she had arrived, she let herself imagine what it might mean to stay here, not just through the winter, but beyond it. Not just as a housekeeper, but as someone who belonged. The long night's conversation. The storm had not eased by the time the lamps burned low. Snow beat against the windows in frantic bursts, rattling the panes in their frames, and the wind whistled around the eaves like a restless spirit. Sarah had finished her mending hours earlier, but neither she nor Marcus had gone to bed. There was something in the air. Not tension exactly, but a charge like the moments before lightning strikes. They sat opposite each other in the fire's glow. Marcus with his long legs stretched toward the hearth, Sarah curled in the corner of the settee with her feet tucked beneath her. Outside the world was sealed in white. Inside it was sealed in warmth. Marcus broke the silence first. "You've been here almost 2 months." His voice was quiet, more observation than question. "Yes." Sarah's hands rested loosely in her lap. "It doesn't feel that long." "That's because you've worked harder than most people do in twice the time." He paused, his eyes on the fire. "I'm not easy to live with." She smiled faintly. "You're not as impossible as you think." He looked at her then, and the flicker of the flames caught in his pale eyes. "You've seen more of me than I meant for you to." Sarah didn't flinch from the weight in those words. "And I've stayed." Something shifted in his expression, a softening she had rarely seen. Most people run from grief. They can't stand the sight of it. But you, he shook his head, you don't turn away. Because I know what it's like to have no one willing to look. They sat with that truth between them, the fire popping softly in the grate. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for a moment Sarah thought he might say more. But instead he simply said, "Thank you," and leaned back again. It wasn't a grand declaration, but in that moment Sarah understood that trust, real trust, had been earned here. And it was worth more than any promise. The gift of a scarf. The next morning dawned bitterly cold, the storm spent, but leaving behind a world buried under deep snow. The air outside bit at exposed skin, and Sarah wrapped herself in her thickest shawl to carry out scraps to the chickens. She returned with cheeks flushed, boots dusted white, and found Marcus in the kitchen holding something in his hands. It was a scarf, thick, warm, and hand-knit in a deep, earthy green. "You should wear this," he said simply, holding it out to her. She hesitated. "I have my shawl. That thing's no match for January wind." His tone left little room for argument, but there was no hardness in it. Sarah took the scarf, running her fingers over the wool. It was new, the fibers soft and smelling faintly of cedar. "Where did you get this? Had Tom bring it from town last week?" The realization struck her. It wasn't something he'd had lying around. He'd thought ahead, planned for her comfort, in the same quiet, deliberate way he planned for the ranch. She met his eyes. "Thank you." He nodded, looking away, but Sarah caught the faintest twitch of his mouth before he left the room. That day, as she went about her work, the scarf around her neck was more than just warmth. It was a reminder that Marcus Thorne was watching out for her in his own way, a way that spoke in actions rather than words. The stranger at the gate. 3 days later, the snow still clung to the land in uneven drifts, but the sky was a clean, pale blue. Sarah was sweeping the porch when she saw a rider approaching from the east. The man was broad-shouldered, his coat dusty, his hat pulled low. Something about the way he rode loose in the saddle with a lazy kind of confidence set her on edge. He reined in at the gate and tipped his hat. "Mornin', miss." Marcus Thorne, around Sarah, hesitated. "He's out with the hens." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Shame. I'll wait." He dismounted, looping his reins over the fence. His gaze swept the porch, the windows, her face. It was not the look of a neighbor stopping by. Before Sarah could think of a reason to send him away, Marcus appeared from the barn, walking with that steady, deliberate stride she had come to know. His eyes flicked over the man, then to her. "You've got no business here." "Briggs," Marcus said, voice low and edged. "Just thought we could talk about those grazing rights again," the man replied, smiling like a man who knew his answer would be refused. Marcus stepped forward, closing the space between them until the smile faded from Briggs's face. "The answer's the same as last time, and the time before that. Now get off my land." Briggs held Marcus's gaze for a beat too long before swinging into the saddle. "You used to be more neighborly, Thorne." "Not to people who come sniffing around my house," Marcus said. The man rode off and Marcus watched until he was a speck on the horizon. Then he turned to Sarah. "If you see him again, you come find me. Don't talk to him. Don't let him in." Sarah nodded, her heart still beating fast. In that moment, she realized Marcus's protectiveness wasn't just a matter of pride, it was personal. Supper for two. That evening, the kitchen was filled with the scent of stew and fresh bread. Sarah set the table for two as always, but tonight, Marcus lingered after the meal instead of retreating to his study. He poured himself another cup of coffee, then gestured to the pot. "You want one?" She accepted, and they sat together at the table, the lamplight casting a warm circle around them. "Briggs won't be back for a while," Marcus said, breaking a piece of bread. "But men like him don't take no forever." Sarah met his gaze. "Then it's a good thing you're here." His eyes held hers for a long moment before he looked away. "It's a good thing you are." The words hung between them, unexpected, and heavier than they should have been. She sipped her coffee, her heart thudding in her chest, wondering if he felt the same shift she did. The broken fence. 2 days later, Marcus returned from the south pasture with snow on his coat and a scowl on his face. "Fence is down along the creek. Looks like someone cut it." Sarah felt a chill unrelated to the weather. "Briggs, maybe. I'll ride out tomorrow and set it right." He glanced at her then, and his voice softened. You'll stay close to the house." The next morning, Marcus left before dawn. Sarah kept busy baking bread, mending clothes, sweeping the hall, but her mind kept drifting to the creek and the man who might be waiting there. It wasn't until she heard the sound of boots on the porch that she breathed easier. Marcus came in tired, his hands raw from the cold, but the fence was fixed. "No sign of him," he said, "but I'll keep watch." It was the way he said "I'll," as if the safety of the ranch of her was his alone to guard, that stayed with her long after he'd gone upstairs. The lantern in the window. That night, the snow began again, fine and steady. Sarah set a lantern in the kitchen window, its light a warm beacon in the dark. She didn't know if Marcus noticed. It was the kind of gesture that didn't need to be acknowledged. But when he came down for breakfast the next morning, there was a subtle change in his expression. "You put the lantern out," he said. "Yes." "Why?" "So you'd know you were coming home to someone awake." His eyes softened, and for a moment she thought he might say more. But he just nodded once, as if committing the gesture to memory. The start of something. By the end of January, the tension from Briggs' visits had faded into the background, but something else had taken its place, something quieter, more difficult to name. Sarah noticed it in the way Marcus looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, and in the way her own pulse quickened when their hands brushed over the breadboard in the kitchen. One evening, as they stood side by side washing and drying the supper dishes, their hands bumped over the same plate. They both reached for it, then both drew back. "You take it," Marcus said, his voice low. She did, setting it gently in the rack. When she looked up, he was still watching her, and in that moment the distance between them felt like something that could be crossed, not with a step, but with a choice. The trip to town. When the sky finally cleared to a hard crystalline blue and the roads hardened under weeks of packed snow, Marcus announced they'd ride into Millfield for supplies. It had been nearly a month since Sarah last stepped foot in town. The thought of it put a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. She wrapped the green scarf around her throat, his scarf tucking the ends into her coat, as Marcus saddled the horses. Tom offered to go in his place, but Marcus shook his head. "We'll be quick," he said, the wee landing in Sarah's ear like a promise. They rode at a careful trot, hooves ringing against the frozen road. The mountains rose in glittering relief, every pine branch jeweled in frost. Sarah stole glances at Marcus as they descended toward the valley, his jaw set against the cold, his hat brim slicing the sun. His presence so steady it felt as essential to her as breath. When Millfield came into view, the familiar shape of the church steeple and the square of weathered storefronts, Sarah's pulse hitched. Gossip had long memory. So did Mrs. Henderson. They dismounted by the general store. Marcus tied the horses, then offered his gloved hand to help her down. The gesture was simple, practical. Still heat pulsed at her wrist where his fingers closed around it. Inside, the pot-bellied stove roared. Conversations dipped as they entered the way prairie grass falls before a gust. Mr. Avery, the shopkeeper, recovered first, tipping his cap. "Morning, Mr. Thorne." "Miss." Marcus placed a neat list on the counter. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee. 2 sacks of oats. Nails, number 8s. And the spool of blue thread Miss Mitchell asked for. Sarah blinked. He'd remembered. Before Mr. Avery could answer, Mrs. Henderson materialized between barrels of beans like a judgment dressed in calico. "Well, if it isn't Thorne Ranch." Her eyes slid to Sarah. "You look well enough." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Henderson." Sarah said evenly. I suppose you'll be back before long, the woman went on, brittle smile intact. No one lasts there. Not with his temper. Marcus's body went still in the way of a coiled wire. He turned, not looming, simply present. Mrs. Henderson, he said, his tone neither sharp nor soft. Miss Mitchell is under my protection and in my employ. She is owed respect. The room seemed to tilt. It wasn't loud. Nothing about him was but the line of his shoulders made clear that this conversation had ended. A breathless pause. Then the men at the nail kegs found urgent interest in catalogues, and Mrs. Henderson's mouth pinched shut. Mr. Avery cleared his throat. We'll get you loaded up, sir. They finished quickly. Marcus took the heaviest sacks himself, despite two teenagers hovering to help, and Sarah carried the smaller parcels. As they stepped back into the dazzling afternoon, relief washed her. Marcus offered his hand again as she mounted. You didn't have to say anything, she murmured. I did, he replied, meeting her gaze. You live under my roof. People will speak to you like you belong in this town, or they won't speak at all. They rode home with the sun tilting west, breath smoking in white plumes. On the rise above the ranch, Sarah looked back at the pale ribbon of road and forward to the house, squaring itself against the wind. Between what she had left and where she was going stretched a span of snow that felt oddly like a bridge. She tightened the scarf at her throat. Belonging, she thought, was sometimes just the quiet fact of who rode beside you, sparks in the dark. The first sign was the smell sharp wrung a bitter tang that cut through wood smoke as Sarah banked the parlor fire that evening. She straightened, nostrils flaring. Not the stove, not the hearth. This was resin and panic. She moved toward the back hall just as the bell by the barn clanged once twice Tom's alarm. In an instant she was running, skirts hitched, boots finding the path without sight. Cold slapped her face as she burst into the yard. Orange licked at the low sky behind the equipment shed a smear that brightened with each breath. Marcus, she shouted as if he were not already sprinting from the bunkhouse with two hands behind him. He tossed her a glance, assessing quick a flash of blue like winter steel, and then he was all motion, hauling the pump cart, barking orders, dividing men with the general's economy. Winds out of the north, keep the line on the south wall. Tom with me. Keep the horses away from the east corral. If that goes, we lose half the herd. The fire had taken the old tarred roof like a match to paper. Heat rolled at them in waves. Sarah grabbed a canvas bucket and joined the relay without asking permission, hands stinging as water sloshed over her knuckles and froze into glittering shells. She moved with a rhythm of work she knew by heart, fill pass throw, fill pass throw. Sparks clung to her sleeves. She slapped them out and kept moving. Someone shouted a crack like a gunshot as a beam split and folded in on itself. The men yelled to pull back. Marcus ran forward. Don't. The word tore from Sarah before she could swallow it. He vanished to the smoke at the door, reappearing seconds later with a limp shape over his shoulder. The blacksmith's dog, a useless creature so terrified it had wedged under a workbench. He thrust the animal at a hand and went back in. Time fractured into heat and noise. Sarah's lungs burned. The bucket line faltered, reformed. The pump chuffed. Water hissed to steam on contact. Then a wall caved inward, plunging the west side in a gout of flame that leapt high enough to carve the night. The men staggered back. For a heartbeat, everything was noise until Marcus emerged again, coughing hard, eyes red, hair singed at the edges. He pointed, voice hoarse. "She's lost. Keep it off the hay." They fought the fire to a starving hiss by midnight. The shed was a blackened carcass, but the hayloft and the long line of corrals stood defiant in the flickering moonlight. Tom limped past, soot-streaked and grinning tiredly. Could have been the whole yard, he rasped. Could have been the house. Sarah found Marcus by the pump hands on his knees, breath sawing. She touched his sleeve. "You're burned." He looked at her as if only now remembering she existed then down at his forearm where the skin was reddened and blistering in patches. Later, he said, but swayed. Now she said the word, brooking, no argument. In the kitchen, she eased him into the chair by the stove, cut away the ruined cuff, and set about cleaning and salving the burns with swift competence borne beside other sick beds other nights. Marcus watched her with the hollowed-out look of a man measuring his losses and finding this time he could live with them. When she finished, she wrapped his forearm in clean linen and tied the ends snug. He flexed his fingers carefully. "It was set," he said flatly. "Kerosene." "Someone wanted us to run out of water in luck," Briggs Sarah said. "Not a question." Marcus's eyes lifted to meet hers. "Let him come in daylight next time," he said, and there was a promise in it that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with standing his ground. "We'll be ready." The creek at night readiness meant more than rifles and watchmen. It meant habits, signals, contingencies. Marcus drafted them with a soldier's mind, and Sarah took her place in the plan as naturally as if she'd been born to it. A lantern in the kitchen window meant all was well. 2 lanterns offset meant strangers near. The iron bell on the back porch a single strike to summon hands, 3 to summon everyone. She learned the night rounds the creek's floorboards made in an empty hall, the way moonlight laid a silver blade across the east pasture when the clouds broke. 3 nights after the fire, the dogs started up at a sound too soft for human ears. Sarah rose from bed without lighting a candle, moving through the house by feel her palm along the wainscot. The counting of steps to the stair landing the draught that always sighed beneath the study door. In the kitchen, she set the first lantern in the window. The night pressed against the panes like a held breath. She waited. On the table lay the second lantern, wick-trimmed, oil full. A glint moved at the edge of the creek. Not light absence of it, a darker shadow, sliding where no shadow should be. Sarah lifted the second lantern and placed it 2 panes over the agreed signal. Before she could strike the bell, a figure detached from the cottonwoods and stepped into the yard as if he owned the dark. Briggs. He was broader up, close his smile a little too quick. "Evening," he drawled. "Didn't mean to startle. Thought I'd have a word with Thorne." "Mr. Thorne isn't here," Sarah lied evenly, though her pulse thudded in her throat. "You'll need to come back by daylight." Briggs's gaze drifted past her to the kitchen's warm interior and the neat order of a life at peace. "You've made yourself real at home for a housekeeper." He took a step closer, eyes sliding, assessing. Shame if something were to disturb all that. Sarah held his gaze. "You should leave." Her hand found the bell rope. He moved a fraction faster. "Now let's be." The yard erupted with sound boots on hard ground, the twin silhouettes of Marcus and Tom, breaking from the shadows by the barn rifles leveled. Briggs froze, hands lifting a little. Marcus's voice came low and calm. You're on my land, Briggs. You've set fires. You've cut fence. You'll ride out now and you won't ride back. The sheriff will take your statement tomorrow if you've got one worth hearing." Briggs smirked without humor. "You going to shoot me in front of a lady I won't need to," Marcus said. "You'll choose to leave." A taut second, and then Briggs did what men do when they recognize relentless ground. He backed. "This isn't over," he said, mounting. "It is," Marcus replied, the rifle unwavering. "You just don't know it yet." When the hoofbeats faded, the night fell back into itself. Tom exhaled. Somewhere a horse stamped. Marcus lowered the rifle and turned to Sarah. "You did well," he said, voice rougher now that the immediate edge had passed. "Lanterns. Bell. You held him long enough." "I wasn't afraid," she said, and only when she heard the words did she realize they were true. "Not with you here." He looked at her then like a man sees water after months of dust. "I'm here," he said, as if he needed the words as much as she did. Then softer, "I'll be here." The measure of care. In the quiet that followed, winter resumed its deliberate work, grinding ice at the creek, combing the grass, flat under snow, polishing the sky to a hard, pale shell. Briggs did not return. The sheriff rode out 2 days later to take statements and found only a scorched patch where a shed had stood and a rancher unwilling to be bullied. Word traveled fast. None of Briggs's men came near the south pasture after that. Trouble had weighed its odds and ridden elsewhere. Marcus's burns healed slowly beneath Sarah's careful bandages. Each morning she unwound the linen and resalved the skin, her fingers gentle, her attention exacting. He endured the treatment with a stoicism that frayed at the edges when she touched a tender place. He never pulled away. Their conversations over the neat geometry of gauze and salve ranged from practicalities, grain prices, caving schedules, to unexpected ground. He asked about the hymn her mother favored when the house felt heavy. She asked about the first colt he'd ever broken and whether he still dreamed of wild horses. He did. One evening, when wind cuffed the corners of the house and the lamps burned low, Sarah found him in the sitting room, standing before the mantel. The photograph lay face down where it had always lain. He didn't look at her as she entered, but something in his posture told her he knew she was there. Slowly he reached, then stopped. His hand hovered above the frame fingers, flexing. "I've left it like this," he said, voice barely more than breath. "Because looking hurt, and not looking told me I still felt it." "You can feel and look," Sarah said softly. She stepped beside him, the heat of his shoulder near enough to warm her sleeve. "Love doesn't unmake grief, and grief doesn't unmake love." For a long heartbeat, the only sound was the hush of the stove settling. Then he turned the photograph over. Emma's laughing eyes, Lily's toothless grin, the young man standing behind them unburdened, unweathered, looked back into the present with an intimacy that pressed tears up behind Sarah's eyes. Marcus's breath left him in a long, unsteady line. He didn't touch the glass. He only looked. "Thank you," he said eventually, though she wasn't sure whether he meant for the words or for standing there and not filling the silence with anything but presence. Later he paused at the kitchen door before heading into the white bite of morning. "You changed this house," he said without turning. "Not with chatter. With staying." The word felt heavier in his mouth than any vow. "Then I'll keep doing it," Sarah answered. She meant the bread and the bandages, yes, but also the lantern in the window, the second chair drawn close to the fire, the gentle insistence that a shrine could be a home again. Care, she had learned, is not what you say. It's the shape your days take when no one is watching. Spring's thaw. When the thaw came, it came all at once like a held breath released. Water sang everywhere down eaves along the ditch beneath the skin of the creek, where ice broke in glittering rafts and went jangling past the cottonwoods. The hills shrugged off their white shoulders. Mud took the yard in hand and worked it loose. Calves blinked at the new world on wobbly legs, and even the hands men not given to lyrics spoke more softly than winter allowed. Sarah flung windows wide on the first day that touched 50, letting the house drink deep. She aired linens on the porch and beat rugs until dust leapt up and dissolved into sun. In the east wing she hesitated outside Lily's door, then went in. Not to dust the same motes forever, but to open the curtains and let spring lie across the small bedspread like a blessing. She did not move the doll. She only straightened its dress and smoothed the pillow with a palm that said, "Both hello and I remember." That evening Marcus returned late from the south pasture, with mud on his boots and a light in his eyes that matched the season. He stopped short in the hall, catching the clean-edged smell of open windows, and followed it to the sitting room. The photograph stood upright on the mantel, unabashed in the fading light. He looked at it, then at Sarah, where she stood by the hearth with a dish towel over her shoulder. "I keep thinking of something Emma said he told the room, or the picture, or Sarah. That life finds its own banks when the flood has done what it must. Rivers remember how to run," Sarah said, "even after winter." He nodded. A silence opened, the good kind. Then he crossed the room with that deliberate stride she knew as well as her own breath, and stopped an arm's length away. "I would like you to stay," he said simply. "Not because I need a house kept, because I need a life kept, and I've learned that mine keeps better when you are in it." The words landed like warm rain on dry ground, gentle, steady all at once. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She thought of the girl at the post office with 53 cents and a prayer of the green scarf of the bucket line steaming under starlight of 2 lanterns in a kitchen window. She thought of the way loneliness had changed shape in this place, until it looked suspiciously like home. "I choose to stay," she said. "I've been choosing every day." They did not rush the moment. Marcus reached for her hand, as if testing the strength of a new-built bridge, and she gave it palm-sure fingers warm. Outside the mountains kept their posts. A calf bawled and was answered. Somewhere in the grass, a lark found reason enough to sing. Later, when the first stars pricked through the soft dark, Sarah hummed while she washed the supper plates, and Marcus, drying beside her, joined on the second stanza, a low thread more felt than heard. The house listened, and what it heard was not the noisy chaos of a life too full, nor the hallowed hush of grief sealed in amber, but the ordinary music of 2 people making room for both love and memory. In the morning, she would plant a line of hardy rose cuttings along the front walk. Emma's favorite, Marcus, said a pink that looked nearly white in certain light, and the wind would lift their scent into the rooms all summer. The photograph would remain upright. The study door would rest ajar, and each night a single lantern would glow in the kitchen window, not as a signal of danger or a plea for help, but as a quiet declaration that someone waited and that the way home was at last unmistakable. The night had thinned into a pale gray as the first hints of dawn crept over the ridge, painting the treetops with cold light. Everett's horse moved at a steady clip, its hooves striking sharp against the frozen ground. The air was knife-thin cutting at his lungs, but it kept him alert. He had chosen to ride ahead of the others, not because he wanted the solitude, but because he knew the final stretch would demand a quieter approach. Somewhere ahead lay the old stone mill, abandoned for 2 decades, but now lit with the faint, intermittent glow of a lantern. If the stories were true, this was where they kept her hidden away, like some relic nobody dared to name aloud. He dismounted at the bend, where the road narrowed into a tunnel of skeletal oaks. Every sound seemed magnified: the rasp of his breath, the creak of saddle leather, the muted crunch of frost underfoot. He thought about turning back, not out of fear for himself, but because the ending felt inevitable. Someone would not walk away from this. Still, he pressed forward, hand brushing the revolver at his side, eyes locked on the faint glimmer up ahead. Inside the mill, the air was warmer, but stank of damp wood and kerosene. The lantern sat crooked on a crate, its flame bowing with each draft that sneaked through the warped boards. In the far corner, a figure shifted, shackled but upright, face pale against the darkness. She looked at him without recognition at first, as if her mind had been anchored somewhere far beyond this room. Everett's boots rang faintly on the stone floor as he crossed to her, scanning the shadows for movement. No guards, no voices, just the hollow drip of water through the beams overhead. "I'm getting you out," he said, and her lips parted, but no words came. The key lay on a hook beside the door, almost insultingly within reach, and he freed her wrists in silence. When she tried to stand, her knees buckled, and he caught her weight against his chest. The sound of wind outside rose sharply, and with it came a noise he had been dreading, hoofbeats closing in fast. The rescue was no longer the hard part. Getting out alive would be. They slipped out through the rear of the mill, where the wall had collapsed years ago, into a gully choked with brambles and frost. Everett half carried her, the cold biting at their faces, the distant clatter of hooves growing sharper with each heartbeat. He knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the riders reached the front and swept the place. The plan was crude: cut across the gully, take the river path, and lose them in the thicker timber. But plans crumble quick when a voice calls your name in the dark. Granger. The shout rolled down from the slope, followed by the crack of a rifle shot. Bark exploded from the trunk beside him, spraying his coat with splinters. He ducked low, urging her forward, and they scrambled toward the sound of running water. The river was half frozen, a treacherous sheet of ice and rushing channels, but it was their only cover. Without pausing to think, he led her in the shock of cold surging up his legs, the noise of the current swallowing their pursuers' shouts. The river carried them further than Everett had expected, dragging them around a bend before spitting them onto a narrow bank littered with roots and stones. He hauled her up first, then scrambled after her, lungs burning. Above them, the ridge loomed dark against the dimming stars, but there was no sound of riders, only the dull roar of the water they had just escaped. She coughed hard, curling in on herself, and he draped his coat over her shoulders. Not far now, he told her, though he wasn't certain. The old mining road cut along this side of the ridge, and if they could reach it before daylight, they might vanish into the high passes. He took her hand, steadying her, as they climbed the steep path, both of them slipping on loose shale. At the top, the road stretched empty, dusted with frost, and for a moment Everett thought they might have outrun it all. Then came the echo, slow, deliberate hoofbeats, somewhere behind, not rushing now, but stalking. Whoever followed them wasn't in a hurry. That was worse. They made camp in the shadow of a rock outcrop, a meager fire hidden behind stacked stones to shield its light. She sat close, her hands trembling as she warmed them over the flame eyes fixed on the dark beyond. "You could leave me," she said suddenly, her voice hoarse. "They're after me, not you." Everett shook his head, tearing a strip of cloth to bind the raw skin at her wrists. "It's too late for that," he replied. He had crossed a line the moment he stepped into that mill. Turning back wasn't an option. Somewhere in the dark a night bird called, followed by silence so deep it made his ears ring. He checked his revolver, the weight of it, both comfort and burden. Dawn would bring no safety, only clearer sight lines for whoever hunted them. But as he looked at her, hunched beneath his coat, a strange calm settled over him. They had made it this far. The next move would have to be decisive, final, and in his gut, Everett knew the end was already racing toward them, as certain and unstoppable as the sunrise. The first light of dawn bled over the ridge, casting the world in cold silver. Everett doused the fire with a handful of dirt, listening. The hoofbeats had returned closer, now pacing somewhere down the mining road. He nudged her gently. "We move." She didn't argue. They broke camp in silence, climbing the slope toward a notch in the ridge he remembered from years ago. The wind cut at their faces, carrying the faint metallic tang of snow, but it also masked their steps. Every 100 paces Everett paused, scanning the brush for movement. A flicker of motion too steady to be wind caught his eye along the lower trail. One rider, black coat, wide-brimmed hat, the kind of figure that didn't need company to be dangerous. "Keep low," he whispered. They hugged the cliff face, slipping over loose gravel, until the path narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for one person. Ahead, the pass opened toward the high timber line and maybe safety, but the rider's pace told Everett they had minutes at most before steel and powder caught up. The ledge turned treacherous, forcing them to move single file, her hand clutching the back of Everett's coat. Below, the drop fell away into a tangle of pines and frozen scree. A rifle cracked the shot, ringing too close, and stone chips stung Everett's cheek. The rider had dismounted, taking careful aim from the slope below. Everett shoved her forward. "Go!" She scrambled toward a break in the ridge while he drew his revolver, returning fire. The echo rolled like thunder, startling a flock of ravens from the crags. He fired twice more, enough to force the man into cover, then ran hard after her. When he reached the break, she was crouched behind a boulder, breathing hard but unhurt. He grabbed her arm. "We can't outrun him on this trail," he said. "We'll have to lose him another way." Her eyes widened as she looked toward the drop. "You mean?" He didn't answer. He'd already started down the narrow deer path that cut into the ravine, a path most men wouldn't risk. Behind them, the rider's boots crunched over the ledge, closing in. The ravine swallowed them in shadow, its walls slick with frost and moss. The path zigzagged steeply, demanding both hands to grip the rock. Twice she slipped, and twice Everett caught her, the sound of their breaths loud against the muted roar of water far below. The rider's silhouette appeared at the rim above, a black shape against the morning sky. He didn't bother calling out, just raised his rifle again. Everett yanked her against the wall as the shot splintered rock inches from her shoulder. They pushed harder, half sliding, until the ravine opened into a narrow gorge where the stream cut fast and deep. A fallen log bridged the gap, its bark slick with ice. Everett crossed, first testing each step, then turned to help her. Midway, the crack of another shot ripped the air. The log shuddered, and she nearly went over, but his grip held fast. Together they made the other side, vanishing into the thick evergreens just as the rider reached the edge, his face unreadable in the pale light. They didn't stop running until the trees grew so dense the light itself seemed to thin. Here sound carried strangely, every footstep muffled, every breath dampened. Everett slowed, listening. No pursuit. Either the rider had lost their trail or chosen not to follow into this part of the forest. She leaned against a cedar, eyes closed, her breath misting in the cold. "Why here?" she asked when she could speak. Everett scanned the shadows. "Because this forest doesn't give back what it takes," he said. Old miners had told him stories of men who wandered in and never found their way out. It was a risk, but it was also a shield. They moved carefully, marking trees with small cuts, the ground rising toward a ridge where the forest broke into a meadow. The moment they stepped into the open, Everett knew they weren't alone. A second rider sat waiting on the far side, rifle resting casually across his lap, the rising sun catching the pale scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. The trap had closed. The second rider's smile was thin, humorless. "You've led her a long way, Granger," he called, voice flat as the frost underfoot. Everett stepped in front of her, his revolver steady. "You're not taking her." The man's gaze flicked to the tree line behind them. The first rider emerged there, blocking their retreat. 2 guns, 2 men, no cover. Everett's mind worked fast, eyes darting to the slope on the meadow's far side. Steep, rocky, but maybe survivable. He leaned close to her. "When I fire, you run. Don't stop." She didn't argue. The first shot split the air and she bolted, skirt tearing against the brush. Everett fired again, moving sideways to draw both riders' aim. The return shots came fast, one grazing his side, heat blooming under his ribs. He staggered, but kept firing, his world narrowing to the rhythm of the gun, and the sound of her footsteps fading over the ridge. The last thing he saw before the meadow tilted and went dark was her figure breaking into the light beyond free. He smiled through the pain, knowing he'd bought her that.